Evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight on our 225th episode of Warp and Woof Radio, presented by the Comenius Institute. Grateful for the support of folks in and around Indianapolis, folks that are supporting us at IUPUI, where I teach. And that's the great opportunity that I have to be invested in the public square as an educator. This is an episode that is a little bit different than most, where I'm the interviewer and everybody else does the talking. And in this case, I'm going to throw it to my interviewer, who is Luke Haskins. And Luke, tell everybody about yourself.
Hey, Mark. So my name's Luke Haskins. So I am on the board of the Comenius Institute, and right now I'm going through law school at IU McKinney. I've been thinking a lot about the issue of the social contract through various courses, through property courses, and through multiple other courses that I've gone through that have kind of made me start to ask a few questions. And Mark was kind enough to allow me to ask him a few questions and to kind of get his perspective from a Christian perspective. So I look forward to asking you some questions.
Yeah. Well, I'm ready. Have at it when you're ready.
Excellent. So let me start off with just a general idea of sort of this question of, I think most of what we talk about when we talk about the social contract has to do with kind of a view of authority and a Christian's view of authority. Why do you see this question from the beginning of social contract and of authority to be something that is an important question within the Christian and intellectual community?
So I think all things come back down to one basic question, and that is who says. So the question of authority is really the very first question that everybody asks. Basically, who are you to tell me what to do? And if we're honest and upright about what the social contract is, social contract basically says, I'm going to give you some of my freedom in order to have safety and security. So if the government is the one providing safety and security, I'll give up some of my freedoms in order to make sure that that happens. But in so doing, I'm giving up some of my authority, that is, over my own life and my own self. This is true in lots of different venues. Let me just give some practical examples. Practical examples would be things like stopping at a stop sign. I can't run the stop sign and not be against the law if I get caught and get some kind of ticket given to me. I should expect the ticket because I have broken that law. So did the stop sign impinge upon my freedom? Well, sure. But living in this country, I have given up some of that freedom in order for me to have safety and security, which, oh, by the way, is afforded me by the stop sign, so that everybody else is stopping at the same time and doesn't run into me and kill me. Which I should also add that the stop sign is really a great pro-life argument. The reason why stop signs exist is because we actually care about the lives of people.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. So you talk about safety and security. Is that kind of your general description of what the social contract is, or how would you define sort of the idea of what a social contract is? First of all, kind of just from a general sort of what people understand the social contract to mean and to be, and then what is a Christian's view of the social contract, if it's different.
Yes.
And how is it the same? How is it different?
So social contract basically, we won't go into the history of it, quite frankly, because there's so much of it and it goes back centuries. But let's make it manageable and applicable to everybody. We all afford ourselves not only our freedoms, but our safety and security based on governmental structure. So the government or the state is where folks like famous philosophers like Locke and Hobbes actually went after some of their views of what it meant to actually have a social contract. How do we get along effectively as people in a society without killing each other? if I
Right.
could put it so boldly and bluntly. So the Christian view is that government was instituted by God, and it's actually a structure, an institution that's for our good. So we find the structures of institutions actually started in Genesis 1, where we have the orderly creation. And out of that orderly creation, it allows this function within life, that, the law of gravity, for instance, keeps us all on the earth, things like that. Very simple kinds of ideas. Another institution established would be that of the family in Genesis chapter 2. We hop over to Genesis chapter 9, and we find that the government now is given its parameters and its walking orders, as it were. And so government is instituted by God so that um, people will have a structure within which to function and work. So if I had a whiteboard available, I would draw it something like this. I would draw a rectangle on the board, and that rectangle would identify the law, or in our case, what we're talking about, the social contract. So, what am I willing to give up in order to, inside the rectangle now, is my individuality, my freedom, the kinds of things that might be creative, my creativity would be involved there, but it's got to be within that structure, within that institution, and within the social contract. In essence, if I could go all the way back to Genesis 1 again, I would say that God imbued his world, or literally embedded within his world, benefits for humanity. And the benefit for humanity in this case is what we as theologians call common grace. So things that are given to everybody all over the world. Problem, of course, and maybe this is, maybe I'll stop here and have a transition to a different side of the discussion. But the problem here is that we are sinful people, that we are fallen, and that, as my colleagues in the School of Liberal Arts like to say, it's something called the human condition. And in conversations, I will say to them, well, we theologians just call it sin. The problem for us as human beings is that though we're given this common grace, we have a tendency to literally take that authority and make it power. And we then hold it over people in that sense of thing. So here's another example of this. All of us have been given authority. I'll show you my open hand. All of our authority rests in our open hand. I've been given authority, for instance, to teach the classes that I teach with my students. And my authority is one that I should be caring for them as individuals, a shepherding attitude of leadership, to be gentle and generous with my students. But as soon as I close my hand, now it becomes a fist, and now it's power. And now I'll beat you with it. And so authority has been given to all of us. Students have authority over their studies as much as I do over my classes. So all of us now function within the general scope of, okay, I'm going to give myself up to you as a student, to the faculty member, so that I can learn from you, at the same time giving up some of my freedoms, which basically means my time to watch Netflix. If I want to give up that freedom in order to spend hours studying a subject, then that's on me. I've given up that freedom, but now I've given that authority to somebody else. So I'm trying to give a few different kinds of examples here to make it palatable.
Yeah, no, I think that makes total sense. I'm actually really fascinated by one thing that you said in particular, where you started from kind of the ultimate authority, which is biblically, you would say that God is the ultimate authority. And what caught my attention about that is usually when you're talking about the issue of sort of when you're talking about a social contract, most of the time kind of people immediately jump to the government or the authority or the whoever is kind of in charge, whether it be the president or the king of a certain nation or something like that. And what you're talking about kind of takes it a step further by talking about kind of God as the ultimate authority. And because God is the one that's delegating authority, it also makes me think of some of the classes that I'm taking right now. I'm currently in administrative law, whereby authority is delegated to another group of to an agency or to another body of government. Do you think that? I mean, do you think that that is that a fair kind of assessment? Is that authority in some ways it's an agency sort of a relationship?
It's a great question. I would say that yes, it's agency after it's been given. So I'll go back to your first comments about my belief that there is a transcendent, personal, eternal, triune creator who has made his world in a certain way to function in a certain way and has created institutions in order to do so. So that authority has been given to us as humans, and that comes out of Genesis 1:28, Genesis 2:15, and a myriad of other places where we've been given jurisdiction over the world. And by the way, again, as theologians, we call that vice regency. That is, that we are kind of like vice presidents to the authority that God has given to us. And that authority, the two verbs that really matter in our discussion here from Genesis 1:28 are to manage and conserve, the words that are usually translated rule and subdue. So our job is to manage and conserve the things that have been given to us. So if I could say it this way, from Genesis 2:15, we've been given the responsibility to produce from and protect at the same time that which has been given to us. So let's take it from my perspective, a personal example. I've been given the opportunity to be an academic, study, to read, to think, to write, research, and that's what I do. That's my gift to the world, to my students, to people around me. We have all been given those gifts, that those are all authorities that have been given to us. And how I then produce from them is to benefit people, but I'm also to protect and preserve those things as well. So if they've been given to me, handed down to me, then I bear responsibility for those things. So, just for instance, I have 5,000 books in my house. These books are my tools. They're the things that I've been able to accrue over years and years. And the reason why I have so many books is so it helps me to think from lots of different perspectives and then to share those ideas with students and with groups. So we've been given this authority by God, who has, I view this kind of as an umbrella over us. And then this authority then is given to us. And we now, as agents, getting to your final term here, it's an agency where I now have responsibility to, again, to my students, government, the president to his people, the congressperson to her constituency, the police officer to provide protection as well as order. We have anybody who provides food for us, for instance, we trust them not to poison our food, all of those kinds of things. All of those really exist within a contract that's unspoken. So we expect that the food that we eat at the let's say Chick-fil-A has not been poisoned. Of course it wouldn't. Chick-fil-A is great. We all love it. So we want that food. But our point, of course, is suggesting that the benevolence that's been given to us by God should be now shared with others. Going back to the sinful issue, that's not always the way that plays out. And some people lord it over others and utilize the authority given to them as power, that fist I suggested earlier.
Yeah, that's excellent. It's funny that you say that. I had Chick-fil-A earlier today. So get to the most important thing first. No, it's very interesting. So would you say that the social contract exists not just on a governmental level, but you're saying from a no matter what type of authority you have, that there's some amount of social contract for those who are living under that kind of level of authority, whatever that may be?
Right. So, for instance, you mentioned, for instance, that you were on the board at Comenius. Well, you actually have authority over me. I don't know if you really think about that often enough, but you do.
I didn't until just now, but now, all right.
Now you do.
All right.
Yeah, you can tell me what to do and where to go and all that kind of stuff. No, everybody has authorities over them in one way or another. And most of the time we think about these authorities in terms of government structures because we view the state as the highest of authorities. And of course, as I've suggested already, as a Christian, I don't believe that's true. I believe that authority's been given by God. So when you read the book of Daniel, for instance, and Daniel's told to bow before the king, and he says, no, you're not the sovereign. And there's only one in the world. And thank you very much. I'm only going to bow the knee to him. We find the same kind of thing going on with the apostles in Acts chapters 3 through 5, for instance. Same kind of idea where governmental structures are telling them what to do and what not to do. And the point, of course, is that you can't do that because God's given you the rule. And now, if a human agency is going to tell me to break God's rule, now that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, and actually that's a perfect transition to kind of the next part of what I wanted to talk to you about, which was sort of the idea of a break from governmental authority and in what circumstances that's right. You kind of already sort of obviously touched on this to a certain degree. As I go through and I'm thinking about, I mean, you brought up the idea of Daniel. I think of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace. That entire kind of group of stories is very interesting because we get this kind of perspective of sort of a what God calls us to do in certain ways is break an authority that's wrong. My question to you is, to what degree do you think that a government has to, or an authority as a whole, has to kind of break from what God has called them to do in order for it to be right for those underneath them to not follow their example anymore, or to see the authority as just not legitimate anymore? Does that make sense?
Yes. So let's make it a real practical example, something that's happened in the last few weeks. John MacArthur's church, for instance, in California, has decided to meet no matter what California governor says. And so from his vantage point, from that congregation's vantage point, they have said, God tells us to worship him, and we do it in this way, and who are you to tell us not to do that? Now, there's different perspectives on that, even from a Christian vantage point. But my point in suggesting it is that that's where that particular church is going to draw the line. Other churches will draw the line at different places. So in my case, for instance, if you're going to tell me not to speak Jesus' name, preach his salvation, that's the showstopper for me. No, I'm not going to stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
If you tell me that I need to pledge allegiance to an authority structure or government or institution or group or movement in order for me to teach, let's say, for instance, at IUPUI, I'm sorry, that's a deal breaker for me. You can't make me pledge allegiance to something I don't believe in, which cuts cross grain against the very belief system that I have as a person. And I'll quickly add that's not happened. And quite frankly, I've had a wonderful time at IUPUI, and I love teaching there. But I'm just suggesting this as an example of how some people look at this. I think some Christians go too far to extremes, and this is where we'll get a little political just for a moment. I honestly think that some Christians have become too Americanized. That is, that they think through their American lens before they think through their biblical lens, and I think those need to be reversed. So we can disagree, and that's okay. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement within Christendom right now, especially in a political climate. But my suggestion about that is only to say that we need to think, first of all, what does Scripture teach me? And then how am I going to apply that? The how that I apply that may differ sometimes. But I'm suggesting to you that there are certain things like the Daniel stories, as well as the Peter and Paul stories. When you tell me I can't worship this God, or you're going to tell me I can't talk about Jesus, sorry, that's it for me. So government's authority only goes so far in those cases. And we could, I'm sure, give lots of other practical examples of this, but I'll let you have your next question.
Yeah, you talked about different sort of different people and different Christians kind of drawing the line at different places as far as I'm not going to go this far and I will go to this point. I think that there are certain things in scripture that are very clear cut. You can say, you shall not worship idols, or you shall not steal, or or you shall not kill, or murder, or however you want to say that. But there are multiple things that we can say, okay, we know very clearly over and over again by investigating what the Bible says and what the heart of God is. We can know certain more about that by leaving it to a sort of a person-to-person kind of standpoint. Is that based on sort of man's relationship, like their individual relationships with God, or what's the reason for there being kind of these different standards as far as what is acceptable time to break authority and what's not?
And I would call these different applications of the standard. So I think probably the best place to go to in Scripture would be the book of Proverbs, where we find these universal truths that, generally speaking, are true. So, for instance, in a course I'm teaching now called Argumentative Writing, one of the things I might show my students is a famous line, but one that comes immediately out of Proverbs 15:1 that says, "A soft answer turns away wrath." Well, if you're going to talk about an argumentative writing class, then maybe we should think about softening our answers or our questions or the authority that we come from, those kinds of things.
Right.
I think the book of Proverbs gives us the horizontal impact of our vertical relationship. So the vertical relationship is fear God. So we find in the first 7 verses of Proverbs 1 this idea that my responsibility to enlarge my wisdom, my practical application of life, is that I have to have a good relationship with the one who's made me. But then all the way through the book, we're given all these really practical insights as to how we're supposed to live properly with other people. And by the way, they're not always believing people. So take, for instance, Proverbs 28 and 29. Those 2 chapters are full, and I mean that, full of political statements about how do righteous people react when there's righteousness in the law, when there's justice in the land, or how do righteous people react when the unjust arise to power. So there are 2 very distinctive points of view there. I suggest that because, again, we're in a political season, but also because the Bible is very practical. It doesn't mean that we're going to get an exact answer for every question that we have in life. What kind of car should I buy? What toothpaste should I use? Whatever. I mean, all that stuff, that's just the normal, general universals of life that we have to make decisions about. We're talking about very crucial concerns where I have to exercise discernment based on the information that I've been given. And for Christians, we believe our information comes from a transcendent source called the Bible. And because of that transcendent source and that standard, we then bear the responsibility for exercising that in the proper way. And we don't always do it well or rightly. And I should be quick to point that out. It doesn't mean that we have to, the application isn't always going to be pure. So let me just pause here and give a sidebar about purity. It amazes me that somehow people think that justice in this world and in this life can be pure. I don't know what in the world you're doing here, but you're not really looking at the normal life that everybody lives. There's no complete justice in this life. And that, by the way, is a tremendous reason why I believe that there has to be an afterlife where there actually be justice enacted for those who aren't held to justice in this life. I mean, that's, if I could just preach for a moment, that's all about the book of Psalm 73. Psalm 73, where Asaph says, my foot had almost slipped. I'd almost given up my view of life because I saw that, the rich prospered and never had any problems. And then the famous line that comes in those verses 15 to 17, he says, my feet had almost slipped until I understood their final destiny. So if I know that there's a final judgment, the one to whom I must give an account after this life, then I can be assured of pure justice. I may not see it now. Most probably won't in its fullness, but I can anticipate that it will be in the next life. And that is why one of the many reasons I suggest that the Christian view of this kind of thinking makes the most sense, just in the long view of how we think about life and things. Uh, I've been pontificating there for a while. I'll
No, yeah,
stop
yeah,
and
yeah.
let
No,
you
it
ask.
makes no. That's excellent. And obviously, I think a lot of this conversation has to do with this idea of a Christian's view of um, as you said, no perfect justice can be ever truly had on this earth. But I think to a certain degree, part of, especially from my perspective as somebody who's going through law school and trying to understand some of the basic laws of the country and where those laws come from a more abstract and ideological standpoint. I think talking about what is right and what is just, and how we kind of go against different injustices that we see in our world. I think it's an important question, which I think then leads me to, various. If we're gonna, I think I want to talk a little bit more about something a little bit more kind of specific, which is the issue of what does a Christian do when it sees acts of injustice by its governing authorities or act of wrongdoing by someone in authority over them? Under what circumstance, or excuse me, what does a Christian do if he or she believes that he is under an authority that is doing something unjust? First of all, that doesn't have specific application. They themselves are not the ones being harmed. So let me ask you from that perspective. If I believe that my government is doing something that is legitimately wrong but doesn't directly affect me as a person, what is the right course of action in that case? And then secondly, what is the course of action if I believe that I'm being called to actually do something that is wrong? What are the correct steps for a Christian to take in that circumstance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so many different directions to go with this.
Yeah.
Let me start with the individual, and then I'll work my way back out. Um, my immediate thought is the case of Paul in Acts chapter 21, where he's about to be flogged by the centurion, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't flog me." So he actually uses his citizenship rights in a situation where it's obviously very, very valuable to its person, but he utilizes the law of the land to protect himself. So you have the individual doing that at that particular juncture. You then have these famous statements in the book of First Peter, which take it in a very different direction, where Peter is saying, we find it all the way through the book. Chapter 2, verses 11 to 17, chapter 3, 1 to 17, chapter 4, 12 to 17. These verses all talk about how Christians should respond when they are unjustly treated as a group, as a church, as a whole. And the responsibility is that we live honorably with respect, that nobody can say anything bad about us, when they look at our lives, they see the goodness that we produce in the culture. And so if we wanted to go back to, let's say, the first and second and third centuries of the Roman world, where the church is just beginning, we see some great apologists like Ignatius and Tertullian and Justin Martyr, who are saying to the Roman authorities, look, we, the Christians, are the best citizens y'all got. And I don't know why you think you're persecuting us, or why persecution you think is going to do something good for us. But quite frankly, we're the ones taking care of your sick. We're the ones who are taking care of the babies left on our doorstep and raising them ourselves. We're the ones who, when there's a pandemic, we step up and go out and help people, and the list goes on and on. But we see all the way through church history, of course, that Christians are persecuted for their belief simply because they are Christians. And Jesus said to us in John 13 that it's not because they hate you, they hated me first. So The response then, let's say, for instance, in this country, where quite frankly we have not only titanic freedoms but tremendous protection. We don't suffer like our fellow brothers and sisters in places like China, North Korea, or Cuba, in totalitarian regimes. So we have this great opportunity, of course, to do good things for other people. And I would say to you that there are many Christians who do good, not only in this country but around the world. I say all of that to emphasize this point that my responsibility is to do good. So when I see that, let's say, the government's doing something wrong, back to your original question, to do good may be for me to speak out. I would also say that social media isn't the best place to do this.
Right.
But if you want to speak out, go speak to somebody that can make a difference. I'm not so sure that marching in the street is always beneficial. I'll couch it that way. I'm not suggesting it's not, but sometimes it is. So you have to make a discerning decision about when that time might be. But I'll tell you that this is the one thing that will always be the right thing to do. The one thing that will always be the right thing to do when you see government doing bad, or institutions doing bad, or people in authority turned to power doing bad. This is what you do. This wins every single time. You go out and you do good. That's it. When you do good, you are striking against the very injustices that you see. So when I see people, let's say, for instance, who want to protest, I would say, sure, protest. But what are you doing that's going to do any good for the people that you are protesting for or against? And I would say the same thing about, let's say, this is going to be very specific, postponing games or deciding not to play games. What does that do? Maybe you're making a statement and everybody talks about it for a minute, but are you doing something good for somebody that's benefiting them? Of all the monies that you might have, let's say, for instance, can you do something that's good? Now, I'm not suggesting folks are or aren't. I'm just suggesting that that's the one thing that'll always win the day, to do good. So that's what First Peter emphasizes. It's all the way through First and Second Testaments. The best thing that we can do when government structures do something bad is to do good.
Do you see the church sort of as the central role in that? Obviously, as we have been born again as Christians, we have been, our sins have been washed away, and we're able to start to again learn more about the heart of God and understand justice to a degree that He sees justice, that we may have our hearts broken for what breaks His heart, right? Is the church? Do you see the church as being sort of that central, that kind of is the church? How do you see the church's role, I guess, within a government system whereby the government will sometimes do the right thing and whereby the government will sometimes do the wrong thing?
Sure. So I've got my phone app open to the book of Titus. For those listening or later on hearing this recording, it'll take you 5 minutes to read the book of Titus. Go read it. Paul starts his letter to Titus, who's a pastor of a church. Getting back to your church question, he's saying, look, you live in a really tough spot. You're in a bad place. In fact, he tells in the first chapter, he talks about Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And he's quoting one of their prophets who says this, So then he goes on and he says, okay, so what are you supposed to do in all of this? And he gives 10 verses about what you're supposed to do. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. These are all of the so that statements. Okay, all of you who are younger women, older women, younger men, older men, you do these things. And it then continues, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. So he ties immediately the doing of good to salvation. He goes on then to explain salvation, but he ends by saying the same thing. Declare these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority. Let no one disregard you because you are zealous for good works. That's huge. So, and then chapter 3 is like a repetition of do good, do good, do good. So I suggest that because the church, you're absolutely right, is the proper vehicle for our culture today to do this. And we bear responsibility for it. So that is the agency, getting back to another word that you used earlier, that's going to make the difference in how we respond to injustice and the bad things we see in the world around us.
Within the church, I mean, there are obviously several different, I think there are church groups that have roles basically in every part of either government or society, or helping with healing and helping with, again, feeding the poor and various good things. There are Christians doing good things, I think, all over the world. But there are also, I think, there's a tendency in current sort of American churches to sort of show up at church and just sort of see the how do I put this? I'm trying to figure out how to ask this the right way. I think there is a tendency in American churches to just kind of show up and be there for Sundays, and then to come home and do what they're normally doing at work or at whatever has been keeping them busy at that time. How do we kind of encourage Christians to do good within a community, within their own community, in a way that's tangible, that they can kind of see the opportunities around them and can do good in their own communities?
Yeah, I think this means that you have to actually have your finger on the pulse of your community. So I would say that there are 3 watchwords for all Christians. Whatever we do should be intentional, relational, and local. And so, at the top of this episode, I said we've had 225 episodes. Well, since February of 2016, I've been doing these weekly interviews with people around Indianapolis, Christians who are doing good. Well, there's a reason for that, because we want to showcase people that are actually doing exactly what you're asking in your question. And that is that folks want to know who's doing good and why that's so important. And then maybe how can I maybe emulate that in the culture around me? Mm-hmm. I noticed that there are some comments here. Sometimes I'm not always that great on getting these comments up. So Kelsey, I apologize. Kelsey was one of the first students that met for our Comenius groups at IUPUI. And she asked, so if I understand correctly, reopening churches right now is in the personal choice sphere, not universal. Honestly, from everybody I've been reading and talking to about this very issue, there are people that are going to come down on different sides of it. So I would say this isn't a personal choice so much as I would say it's a church choice. So each choice being autonomous in its own authority makes that kind of decision and then lives with that decision within the state that they live in. So I would say it's a church choice rather than a personal choice, say. Second comment that comes in here is how does the concept of just war tie into a biblical understanding of social contract? Does Romans 13 disqualify the idea of just war? Is there a better way to comprehend the passage? That's a longer discussion, and maybe we could pick that up at a different time. But let me give just a brief response to that. When I think about the social contract, and let's just take the United States of America, and let's be very specific again, we do not have a draft any longer in this country. We have people who volunteer to go fight our battles for us. So that means that there are good people standing between us and the bad people that want to hurt people here. So I emphasize that within Romans 13 because Romans 13 sets up government as a just judge. Government wields the sword, it says. And if I could quote Martin Luther at this point, Martin Luther actually said in a pamphlet that he wrote entitled, Can a Soldier Too Be Saved? Or Can a Soldier Also Be Saved? He said that the soldier should have no qualms about smiting his enemy. That was, I think, the phrase that he used there. Smiting his enemy because he does so under the auspices and jurisprudence of the government that he's under the authority of. Now, you can take issue with that. Just war is a big discussion point. We won't even touch that any further. But under the auspices of the authority for the social contract that we're talking about tonight, that might at least touch on the issue for a moment, give some sense of how we might see that together. We're coming up on a 45-minute span here, so Luke, why don't you ask me one more question, and we'll let everybody have the rest of their evening.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: what? Oh, this is a good one. What do you have any good recommendations as far as books or resources or other ways? Any other sort of resources that you can direct people to either learn more about this or to see it a little bit more from a Christian perspective?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Good.
So here's the book that I would suggest. After the Natural Law, John Lawrence Hill, who teaches at McKinney School here at IUPUI.
Yeah.
And his subtitle is How the Classical Worldview Supports Our Modern Moral and Political Values. Professor Hill and I have struck up a nice, friendly relationship. We go out to coffee from time to time and have long discussions about theology and law. And we're actually going to be doing that again this week. But I mentioned his book, After the Natural Law, because quite frankly, and we haven't really talked about natural law. But if you want to talk about the social contract and the authority of God, theologians would refer to this as the natural law theory. That is, that the laws that have been given, and I think I used the word earlier, embedded in God's creation, have been given to us for our good. And that natural law comes to us from a transcendent source. And again, Christian point of view, personal, eternal, triune creator of the universe. So I would suggest John Lawrence Hill's book. Great book. I just was paging through it here tonight, even before the interview this evening. He speaks about the social contract. He gives the different views, the different people that hold those views, and why those views can be right and wrong in many aspects. Let me end the interview with this general comment. In life, we have two choices in terms of authority. We can say that there's an authority given to us from outside of us. And as a Christian, I believe that's the God of the universe who has made all things, and his son Jesus, who died on the cross for my sin. So that's very important, that we understand that authority or natural law can be given from above to us. The only other option we have, the only other basis we have to go on, is human. So if you're going to tell me that it's a human-based view that somehow we can now, of our own accord, come up with our own laws and keep each other in check, what does the book of Romans say? Paul says in Romans chapter 2, 14 and 15, that we can't even keep our own law. We're like the little kid on the playground who makes up a game, makes up the rules, starts playing the game, finds himself losing, and wants to change the rules. We're just like that little kid. We never want to follow even our own rules. We can't even do that. So my suggestion is that that's the reason why I can't abide by simply a human-centered or oriented or sourced view of the law. It's got to come from outside of myself. So there you go. How do we do?
Thank you so much. Good, and you did phenomenally. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm so thankful that you were able to take some time out of your schedule and be able to talk to me about this. I think I'll take away quite a lot from this. So thank you.
Well, just so everybody knows, this is going to be on the Comenius YouTube channel. You can go back and watch this. There's also a audio recording that we'll have in a couple of days if you'd like that as well. Luke, hang for a couple of minutes and we'll chat about things here after we shut this thing down.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I want to say again, on our 225th episode of Warp and Woof Radio, it's been a joy to do this tonight. Thanks ever so much for being here. We'll look forward to the next time where I get to interview somebody, or maybe Luke will come back and interview me again. But until then, And here's just one last comment here from Nigel, our good friend Nigel. Thanks, you two. Wonderful thoughts and discussions. Thanks, Nigel, for chiming in here tonight. Appreciate it a lot. For everybody out there, thanks ever so much for joining us. Until the next time, blessings on your home.